very loud. Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry about our pulsing lights up here. Nothing like spending $100,000 on LEDs and they blink, and every epileptic in Williamson County is going to have a seizure because of the flashing lights. That's right. We getting this up any at all? Crank it up. Crank it up, way up, way up, way up. Pardon me? They're up all the way. Up more. More. Testing 1, 2. A little more. Testing 1, more. That's it? That's all we got? All right, that's it. That's a whole ball of wax. Let me go try one more time. Testing 1, 2. Yeah, that's great. Great. Okay. All my roadies left early for the 4th of July, so got to do all this myself. It'd be helpful if I knew what I was doing. Because of the funeral on Friday, the time I'd set aside to get the handout prepared obviously was taken up by something else. But we will get the handouts. From the very first class, I actually updated that and expanded it a little bit. And then last week's played around with it a little bit, expanded it. And then I'll get one on there for this week as well. So you'll be able to download those as PDFs off the parish website. Also, we think we got the video working out. So if all goes well, we're on Vimeo Live right now, and hopefully that'll go everywhere else. And Daisy, if that's my mother, tell her I'll call her back after class.
Actually, it's my husband. I didn't wake him up when I left the house. Where are you? Church doesn't start till a quarter of 11.
Give me that phone. I'll call your husband for you.
No. He'll figure it out.
I did have... when I was at St. Joseph years ago, you get close to people after you've been in a parish, for a long time. And a parishioner by the name of Matt, his wife's name was Jenny. Matt was a police officer. And anyway, his phone started ringing during Mass, and I saw him fumbling while I was preaching. And, of course, I'm in the aisle there. I usually stood in the aisle. So I just kept talking and walking. He was paying no attention to me. When he finally got the phone out of his pocket, I snagged it out of his hand and said, "Hello, who is this?" "I'm calling Dad." "Your dad is at church. Why are you calling him right now?"
No, most embarrassing, and most of you people that were here when Father Arnold was here, during that time, I was a nurse that carried a pager.
Uh-huh.
My pager went off. I got up to go out of church. Daisy, where are you going? Pick up church. Father, there's a medical emergency. He said, "Okay, I'll let you go."
Yeah. Daisy with us just told a story about Father Arnold calling her out when her pager went off. We had a second grade teacher. She's still teaching second grade at St. Joseph. Anyway, I just love to tease her, love to tease her. But every Tuesday and Wednesday morning after the morning Mass, I would hear a class, their confessions. And this was 8th grade week. I'd hear half the 8th grade week on Tuesday, half the 8th grade week on Thursday. Well, 8th grade's going to confession, and of course, 8th graders, they're worse than sophomores. They know everything. So, and they love to tease. Well, Jackie, the teacher, had to break line. not to go to confession, but she had to give me a message that was rather urgent. So she stepped in the confessional and handed it, and I looked at it and said, okay, I can deal with this after confession. But anyway, I said, wait just a minute. And she said, what do you mean? I said, sit down. So she sat down and said, there are people waiting in line to go to confession. I know. And said, well, I need to get out of here. I got to go back to my class. Well, okay. And I said, but hang on just a second. So I stood up and I went right next to the door and I yelled as loud as I could, you did what? It took her a long time before she had the courage to walk out of the confessional. Well, just know that I'm getting tired in the confessional, and I thought, I need to end these confessions. There are 20 more people in line. Mass is getting ready to start. Person comes in and said, Father, what's my penance? And I said, 20 rosaries. You got to be kidding. No. And, of course, then I laughed and said, yes, I am. I gave him a real confession. I said, but when you step out, tell everybody else in line, he just gave me 20 rosaries. That line gets short real fast. When we read any of the scriptures, and we're going to see how Scripture functions. And I've been calling these types of literature, and indeed they are, but they're better than anything else. They're a description of how literature functions. And this is something you can use not only just for Scripture, but anything you might be reading. That sometimes the way something is written, just the outline, will tell us something. For example, the Gospel of Matthew. When Matthew constructs his gospel, he uses the outline of Moses' life. He uses that as his outline, and everything in his gospel is hung on the life of Moses, up to a point, because Moses didn't die on the cross, obviously. But Luke sort of follows the structure of Mark. John, he's just out there doing his own thing. Mark being the first gospel, when Mark sets out to write about the life of Christ, he really did not have a model to work from. The best kinds of literature, written language things that were out there was Roman literature, of course, and there was Greek, but nothing really served to say this is the way I should write this thing. And part of what he grabbed onto was what we today would identify in Greek and Roman literature as what's called heroic literature. Think Iliad, Odyssey, those kinds of things where there's these great heroes. So he borrows from that, but even it did not work entirely. So in point of fact, when Mark writes, he is, as he writes, inventing a whole new form of literature. There's nothing else in history that compares to what Mark did. And of course, Matthew and Luke, they pick right up from what Mark did. John follows a little bit more, is a little closer akin to Greek philosophical kinds of writings. John relies heavily, as does St. Paul, relies heavily on Plato. And the way Plato would do things, because he's writing a whole bunch of syllogisms and proofs, and you can almost, if you studied logic in college, if you follow the Gospel of John, you can almost see him setting up the syllogisms, for example, to prove that what we do at Mass is the body and the blood of Christ. Paul constantly is using a background of Plato because he's trying to say things and teach things that, boy, I'm getting so tired of this word, but he's trying to say things and teach things that are unprecedented. It's the last time I'm going to use that word in my whole life. We've heard it all through COVID. They're saying it down in Florida. But there's nothing else. And so Mark, he invents this whole new style. And, as the scholars look at it and especially analyze the Greek and all that kind of stuff, they can sort of see where he's borrowing from other forms of literature. When I say Paul relied heavily on the language of Plato, well, even, Paul is written, Paul writes all of his letters long before Mark writes his gospel. 'Cause Paul is writing just within a handful of years after the death of Jesus, where Mark is not written until 69, thereabouts. But you can see the influence of Plato, and if you've studied Plato, studied philosophy, Paul needs the words. He needs the language to say what he's going to say. Theological language as such has not been born yet. So again, he's inventing. He's, beg, borrow, steal, whatever works. And so what you begin to see in Paul is sort of this either or, darkness or light, sin or grace. And Paul's word for sin, by the way, is thanatos in Greek, which means death. Interesting word that Paul would choose. So you see these opposites. Well, that's straight out of Plato, either or, the way Plato wrote in his philosophy. And two, if you remember your background on Plato, Plato posited that there was a world that we don't see, we can only perceive, where the perfect thing exists. So epistemology, how do we know things? Well, how do you know that is a chair? It's because somehow it's a reflection of the world of forms, the perfect chair. So we can look at it, almost any piece of furniture, unless it's so uber modern, we're not real sure what it is at all. But we see a chair and we say, "Oh, that's a chair. That's a chair. That's a chair. That's a chair." Because and Plato would say it's because we somehow perceive that world where the perfect exists. And Paul borrows heavily from that too. How do we know things? How do we know about God? What's our access to God? So, he's borrowing from that. And Matthew and Luke, they themselves or someone really went back to heroic literature and borrowed from it, because the original Gospel of Matthew, the original Gospel of Luke did not contain the Christmas stories. The what we call the infancy narratives. They weren't there. And that was, people didn't like that because they're used to heroic literature. And what happens in heroic literature? Iliad, Odyssey, that it spends a long time talking about the birth of the hero. And for us today, they spend a long time talking about the mother of the hero. And, the mother becomes so extremely important in any of this heroic literature. And what happens, we pick up on that. Mary becomes so incredibly important to us. They were primed because of their literature to see in the mother of Jesus something truly special. But, heroic literature, it spends a lot of time on the birth and the circumstance, sometimes very explicit about the time, place, date, what was going on at the conception of the hero. Almost 100% explicit, not exactly. Makes it worth learning Greek, I guess. But, if you really want to read stuff that, even the word pornographic comes from the Greek. I'm not going to tell you what it means. But anyway, it's for the Gospels to be absent the story of the birth, well, it's a little bit difficult for people that depend on that heroic literature. And remember, especially with Luke, he's really writing for very much a Greek audience. Matthew starts out as very Jewish, his community, and then it starts becoming more and more Gentile. So you can kind of see the transition he's making between writing for Jews, writing for the Gentiles, and having to teach the Jews Jewish history, teach the Gentiles, the Jewish history, because it's difficult to relate a lot about who Jesus is unless you're in touch with, the Old Testament and its prophecies and, who the Messiah was going to be, what the Messiah was going to do, so we can see them accomplishing all these tasks. But for the Greeks, it was somehow a little disappointing. So either the gospel writers themselves or someone that worked with them, so knew them, a disciple of Matthew, a disciple of Luke. And remember, the word disciple just is not disciple like, he's the Messiah and we're his disciples. The word disciple just means student, disciplos, another Greek word. just means student. So again, borrowing. So students of Matthew, students of Luke, somewhere somebody added what we call the infancy narratives and put them at the front of the Gospels, where they act like a preamble. Now, as in heroic literature, the preambles of Matthew and Luke, the infancy narratives, they functioned like a preamble. You know, if we lost the entirety of the Gospels and we had only the story of the birth, just in that story alone, we have the Gospel in its entirety. Because, you know, Paul probably remembers this, John, you know, for so long that when they taught preaching, you know, preaching has 3 steps. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. You know, the 3 classical steps of preaching. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. Well, in many ways, that's exactly how the infancy narratives function, although they don't do all 3. But they tell you what the rest of the Gospels are going to tell you. And that's why the infancy narrative in Matthew would be so radically, so very, very different than the infancy narrative of Luke, because they're serving as preamble to the Gospels, and the Gospels have different slants and different emphases, I should say. Therefore, the infancy narratives have different slants and different emphases. You know, Matthew's building his gospel using the outline of the life of Moses. So what happens? You know, Jesus is taken into Egypt to avoid, you know, the slaughter of the innocents. Exactly how Moses ended up in Egypt. You know, I mean, so we see all of that. Matthew's gospel has so much to do with the poor, the outcast, you know, the handicapped. And so at the birth, you know, Luke doesn't have magi and doesn't have all of this stuff going on. You know, the angels aren't singing, the angels appear, but only to tell the shepherds that the Messiah has been born, go over there and look at him. You know, but that's the sole function of the angels in Luke, whereas in Matthew they're singing, you know, and all kinds of great things. But Luke softens the whole thing so he can concentrate on the poor. You know, who are the ones that are there at the birth? You know, not kings, not great people, not the mayor, not the governor, but poor shepherds who are the least of the least. People didn't think very highly of shepherds. Now, there were shepherds that owned the flocks, and then there were shepherds that were hired. And shepherds that were hired, you know, they weren't seen in the best possible light. Therefore, when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, you know, there's a, you know, juxtaposition there. So who gets to witness the birth? The poor and the outcast. And Matthew's going to continue that theme all the way throughout his gospel. So, you know, so again, they're borrowing from what they know so that they can tell something that's never been told before. Mark pretty much invents the form. Matthew and Luke depend on Mark, you know, as they get started, but they're, you know, a little further along, and they're probably a lot more educated than Mark himself. Their writing skills are clearly better, especially in Luke. I mean, clearly better. So Matthew contains almost the entirety of the Gospel of Mark. For the longest time, they thought Matthew just was somebody that took the Gospel of Mark and filled in the gaps. You know, that's sort of how they related to it. But it very rapidly became the most favored of the Gospels, read, you know, at their gatherings, which is why it's placed first, Matthew, Mark, Luke, even though it's not the first written. But, you know, so they take what Mark did, they rely on his work, but then they're borrowing from what they know and what their people know as well. So with that said, when we read, we're going to read we're going to read specific types of literature. And I'm going to kind of, you know, imagine them if I had a full blackboard, you know, it would be on a straight line because the first and the last are opposites. But the first form of the functioning of literature in all the scriptures, but also in the gospel, is myth. Now, Genesis is mythic language. Now, we tend to think of myth as a wonderful story with a great moral, but it's not true. Well, that's not the best possible understanding of how myth functions in literature. The role of myth is very, very specific. It is to establish a world view. For the Jewish people, just think of Genesis. If Genesis is mythic literature, and by that we mean it has a very specific function, it is creating and teaching a worldview. How do we, as Jewish people, view the world and all of creation? And so Genesis tells them, who created the world? God created the world. Is the world good or evil? We see all this sin. Well, God saw it and saw that it was good. Well, if God created it and God saw that it was good, well, how did sin get into the world? God didn't do it. We did it. Well, if we did it and we were created by God, why aren't we perfect? Well, God gave us free will, and without free will, there can be no love. There's got to be choice. You cannot love unless there is human choice involved. You chose to, you might have not chosen to fall in love with the person you did, but that may have just happened, but however those things happen, but you did choose to marry this person. There's choice involved, a true expression, outward expression of love that two people would choose to get married. So God gave Adam and Eve free choice. If He created them, and then and then they had an opportunity to choose to love God and return. Well, they didn't make the right choice. Why would they go in such error? Well, then we get this whole notion of Satan, the serpent. And when it talks about the serpent, again, the writer of Genesis, as they tell the story really didn't quite come into being as we have it until they were in exile in Babylon, where they began to hear other countries, other nations' creation myths. Well, the serpent that we hear about, first of all, it's not exactly a snake. The serpent is, think of a serpent as a dragon without legs. The medical symbol is the caduceus, the two winding snakes that has, the wings on them. That's the serpent. And the caduceus comes from the Bible. When, people were being bit they were in the desert, being bit by the seraph serpents. It was making them sick. It was a horribly burning bite. And God said, make a bronze serpent and raise it on a staff, and anybody that looks at it will be healed. So Moses did that, and that bronze serpent, the first caduceus, if you will, it hung in the temple for years and years and years. Why did that cure people? Does that make it an idol? No. It cured people because of this. That serpent was the image of the god Baal. Baal was the god of Canaan, and Canaan is the promised land. So as they get closer and closer and closer, they start to encounter Canaanites and the god Baal, who is a fertility god, and the god Baal is not evil at all. The god Baal was a very good god. In fact, god Baal was so good that people began to think that Baal and the God of Abraham were sort of like the same one, but they weren't. And those that started to sort of kind of follow Baal a little bit, they began to refer to them as being bit by the serpent, the seraph serpent, the image of Baal. And so what happens? If Moses makes a bronze serpent, puts it on a stick, and raises it up, what does that say? It says Moses has control over that God. So remember the first commandment, I am the Lord your God. None of these other guys are your God. I am. So all that works together. But the whole purpose of mythic literature is to help create a world view and explain it. Why do we think this? Why do we believe that? It's very clear in Genesis, that this is what this form of literature is doing. They would have never got caught up in literalism. Literalism, as we experience in our country, is an early 20th century phenomenon. It has never existed in the history of Christianity till in the United States in the early 20th century. So some literature functions as myth to teach us a world view, why we believe what we believe. The more I bend over, the worse my printing's going to get. The second form is apologue, or another word, apology. You know, we hear, I am a church apologist. Well, apologist is not a person that apologizes for stuff. An apologist is a teacher. So the next way literature functions is as apologue or apology. It teaches. If myth gives us the worldview and tells us why we are what we are and answers a lot of basic questions, then the next form of literature takes it a full step further and begins to teach it and explain it. We see a whole lot of that in the Gospels. Now, Jesus' teaching, it's interesting, most of the time Jesus is teaching, he doesn't teach, at least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he doesn't teach on the front end. He teaches on the back end after he's done something. You know, Jesus heals somebody, then he explains it. There are times where he says, just so you can see the glory of God, and it's like, Jesus said, just so you can see the glory of God, watch this, and then he does a miracle. It's kind of like, here, hold my beer. But that's a joke. We can even laugh with Jesus. But so we're going to see literature function as teaching literature, as apology. The next, and probably, I'm sorry, online, I can't see it in my phone, so you probably can't see that either. But the next form of literature, or the next way literature functions, we call it action. The whole purpose of action is to explore the world. Myth has created a worldview, helps us understand why things are, why we are the way we are, who God is. Apology goes into a further depth of teaching and helping us understand. So, okay, how does that work out in the real world? And that becomes the form of action literature. We see that in the historical books. We see that, in First and Second Kings. We see it, in a lot of the stories of the prophets, where it seems like they're just sort of stories. Well, they are just sort of stories. But what they're trying to do is to create situations, and of course when we're dealing with those, we're dealing with, now we're really into kind of history, things did happen. So, the action literature typically is not made up stuff. It's, it might be things that, probably is based on things that really happened, and then their way of using literature, they take what really happened and they massage it and they might rearrange it a little bit, because for them, history is not about who, what, when, where, how much, and how often, what time of day, was it cold outside, were the clouds in the sky. Their purpose of history is to discover meaning within the events of human life. So if it's not about the facts of who, what, when, where, then it's about the meaning, then it's perfectly acceptable, an acceptable thing to do, to rearrange it a little bit so that the meaning itself becomes apparent. And that's what action does. It takes, it puts people in position that they act out what they believe. Just this week, we read the story of Abraham. God tells Abraham that he is going to make of him a great nation. It said, God goes to Ur. Abraham meets God in his homeland of Ur, and God says, I want you to go forth, which was been absolutely astonishing to the people of Ur. They thought poor Abraham had lost his ever-living mind, that he's leaving the community he grew up in. People just never did that. So here he is doing something radically different. Also, the belief of people of the time was that gods belonged to the land, or the land belonged to the god. So the gods of Ur, Abraham's gods, that would have grown up to, were the gods of the land of Ur. And if he leaves Ur, then he's leaving his gods, because gods don't travel, and their way of thinking. But this other God that Abraham meets, well, shock of shocks, this God actually travels with Abraham. We see that again with Moses. God travels with the Israelites. That's brand new in the history of the world. Gods didn't do that kind of thing. It's like, okay, why do we believe these things? Because something radically happened that changed the world forever, that changed the way people think about God forever. We talk about Abraham. It's within about a 50-year period they went from just these traditional pagan beliefs that they had to all of a sudden we got Abraham talking about God. We're talking about, a very, very short historical time that this figure of Abraham changed everything forever. So there's got to be something going on there. But action, it does explore. And as I was saying, God promises Abraham, if you do this, I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Why is that a big deal? Because they didn't believe in an afterlife where the way we do today. They believed that you lived on through your children. So if you have descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky, well, we're talking immortality here forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. So that's, what a promise that God makes to Abraham. Well, Abraham's married to Sarah, and they wander and they wander and they wander. And Abraham and Sarah begin to get a little nervous. They are getting a little bit older, and they've had no children. How can he have an heir? So Abraham gets with one of his female servants, and this was acceptable. We would call it cheating and all kinds of things. But anyway, he got involved with one of his servants, and she got pregnant, and she gave him a son, Ishmael. And Ishmael, legitimately a child of Abraham, and in their way of thinking, that's, you had to guarantee yourself an heir. So if your wife was what they would call barren, then you got a child by another way. That was okay. It's not our morality, but it was okay with them. So then we get to the story where Abraham's he's set camp with all the sheep and flocks and the people that were traveling with him, and kind of this tribal group that are traveling with him. These three people show up in the camp, or at least they're traveling through, and Abraham not only invites them to stop and have water and food and beverage and all that, he tells them, he makes them stop and eat. He demands, because he wants to practice the Jewish practice of hospitality, which is a big deal. You treat people with hospitality because you never know if it might be an angel in disguise. So anyway, he feeds these guys. Well, he truly doesn't realize, but as Scripture goes on, it tells us they are angels in disguise. And the angels tell him that this time next year, Sarah will have had a child. Well, Abraham laughs out loud. This is hilarious. And the Scriptures say that he's 99 and Sarah is 90. Now, that's not saying they're actually those ages, but it is saying they are way beyond childbearing years. Sarah definitely is of an age where, the ovulation stuff has long since stopped. So that's what it's trying to tell us. But Abraham laughs out loud. Well, he calls Sarah out and said, guess what these guys just told me? Sarah laughs out loud. Guess what? They come back a year later and they have a child. And they name him Isaac. The word Isaac means laughter. Just interesting stuff. Okay. When we look at these stories, these are action stories. Because what we see is their faith confronting the real world, real life situations. Now there's some myth stuff in there. David, did you see who's at the door there? They must be desperate to hear all of this. That's right. We'll be talking about why those doors are locked in a little bit. But anyway, it is intentional. Um, so all of that is exploring their faith, exploring what they've been taught. And so that becomes very, very important to us. For those that might be nervous about the 11 o'clock Mass, don't worry, I'm saying it. So you can't be late. I might be, but you can't be. That's going to be a 4, and it's going to say satire. Satire becomes very, very important. Now, we really see satire at its height when we start getting into British literature, especially if we're talking Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels, satire. And satire becomes a really big, big deal. But we see it in the Scripture too. The purpose of satire, if myth creates a worldview, the purpose of satire is to attack that worldview. It attacks what people know. And it does it so it forces you to see what's going on with different eyes. Now, sometimes when we're listening to Jesus, we're hearing satire. Not satire, that's obvious and sometimes funny and all of that, but we hear him outright attacking what people think and believe. He's not trying to do away with it necessarily, but he's trying, and in satire you're really not trying to do away with something, but you are trying to point out its limitations. It's not what it's not as good as you think it is. How many times has Jesus attacked the Pharisees? And when he attacks them, why would Jesus be so concerned about the Pharisees? Well, Jesus, he is not formally a Pharisee, but he's part of the Pharisaical tradition. And that's a good thing. It's neither good nor bad. The Pharisees, as opposed to the Sadducees, as opposed to the Essenes, they had sort of an agenda for Judaism, and their agenda was to get it back on track where they thought it had gone off the rails. Well, that's exactly what Jesus is all about. Taking the people where it's gone, and their faith where it's gone off the rails, and get it back on the rails. Jesus never says the Pharisees are bad people. Now, he will say, you brood of vipers and a lot of stuff like that, but he's attacking, verbally, and the way he says things, he's attacking. Not to say they're wrong, necessarily. In fact, he will say, listen to the Pharisees. Listen to what they tell you. But don't do what they do. Because he likes what they're teaching. What he doesn't like is how they are implementing what they're teaching. He says you lay burdens, on people's shoulders, heavy to bear. And so what are the Pharisees doing? Well, the Pharisees, if they want to get Judaism back into a much more spiritual context, if they want to get Judaism back to, a more pure kind of, all of these different groups out there, it's sort of like Christianity. It's like, say, well, I'm a Christian. Okay, well, that's great, but are you Catholic, Methodist, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Church of Christ, Church of God, Church of God of Prophecy? Because they're all different. Same Lord, same words, same scriptures, but the way we live that out is very different. Now, obviously, the way we worship, for a little bit, it's incrementally different, say, between us, Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Lutherans, but not radically different at all. Those are sacramental churches. They have sacraments. They wear vestments. They say the creed, so we're not radically different, but we are different. So, what kind of Christian are you? Well, you could ask, what kind of Jew are you? Are you a member of that group or this group or that sect or that sect? So the Pharisees want to try to reunite and get rid of all of this external bric-a-brac. And eventually they will go after the Christians. After the fall, just prior to and after the fall of the temple, they begin to see Christians as also being one of these cults. So, they start pushing, they forbid the Christians to go to the synagogues, and which is why even before the fall of Jerusalem, they start leaving Jerusalem, the Christians, and start moving toward Antioch, where they really set up camp, and that's they're finally referred to as Christians in Antioch. First time they're called that, as opposed to being called Jews who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. But do what they tell you. But Jesus, so they were taking, their rationale was, if the temple priest in the temple do this, and this, well, it obviously must be really important. So therefore, in your homes, you need to do this, and this. And we get into all of the purity laws, all the hand washing, all the food washing. Jesus says, you Pharisees, you hypocrites, you wash the inside of cups and kettles, but you don't take care of your insides. So he's attacking. And that's a form of satire. He's not saying he doesn't like what they're trying to do. He's saying, but the way you're doing it, not so good. And in the Pharisaical mind, if you start doing all of these rituals, then you are in fact doing the will of God. You're following God. That's the way they looked at the law. If you follow the law, then you're righteous. You're lined up with the law. And so they began to apply that to rituals as well. And so Jesus begins to attack the rituals, saying, these are man-made. These aren't going to get you closer to God unless they have depth of meaning and they truly serve a purpose and not are merely actions. The ritual acts have to be more than checking the boxes. We say that about Mass a lot. It's got to be more than merely just showing up and checking the box. It's got to have depth of meaning. The last form of literature, and it's the most fascinating of all. I'm going to need a chiropractor after this. The last way the literature functions, I got to come back up here so folks can hear this. The last way literature functions is as parable. We all know about the parables. The parable, and the reason I said see this as a line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 and 5 being opposites. If it's the role of mythic literature to establish a worldview and to help us understand why we think what we think, the purpose of parable is to destroy a worldview. Satire attacks it. Parable destroys it. So when, sometimes the scriptures say, well, this parable, that parable, and they may have been in the beginning a parable, but the way the sower and the seed, Jesus talks about the sower and the seed. Some fell on good ground, some fell on rocky, and then all of a sudden we get this whole explanation. That's somebody added that. That's allegory, because we left the core of the parable of Jesus, and then somebody put allegory in there to help them understand the parable. But again, the role of a parable is to destroy a worldview. The parabolic literature is unique to the Middle East. Now, of course, with the scriptures and going worldwide and us understanding better, we get a whole lot of parable literature today, but it comes to us strictly from the Middle East. When we look at parabolic literature, the number one parable in all of literature is the book of Job. We do read it, as if it's factual history, but it's not. It's a parable. And it's trying to destroy a world view. And the hallmark of a parable, and one of the ways this is truly a parable and not something else, is that there's something in the parable that is not true. But everybody knows it's not true. It's not like you say something and people aren't catching on that this is a lie. No, you purposefully take something that's not true and you tell it as if it is true. The mustard seed. It becomes the greatest of, as we translate it for the longest time, it becomes one of the nicest of trees, and the birds of the air nest in it, and all these great things. Well, yeah, it is the smallest of seeds, and yes, it grows into a very fine, nice bush. But mustard plants are not stout enough to support the weight of a bird. There's no way a bird's going to nest in a mustard plant. And people knew that. Yet Jesus said the kingdom of God is like. So it's like, huh? What exactly are you saying? And then it's funny, in the Gospel of Mark, several times, it'll say, Jesus taught them in parables, and only in parables did he teach them. But afterwards, he met privately with his disciples to explain them. Remember how I told you early on that Mark sets up the disciples as not being, they start out as these great, fantastic, mythic figures, but toward the end of the Gospel of Mark, they're sort of like the Keystone Cops. That's Mark's way of helping dumb them down. It's like, okay, Jesus taught in parables and only in parables, except the disciples. He had to take them off, and he had to tutor them, and he had to have class after class. Okay, guys, I know you don't get it, so here it is. Let me explain it to you in a different way. Why would Mark do that? To go back to things we said before, is that Mark wants us to see ourselves in those disciples. He wants us to be comfortable with saying, I don't get it. It's okay to say, I just read what Jesus said. I don't get it. That's okay, because this is really deep, deep, deep stuff. And so, if we got it on the first pass, we wouldn't have to reread every passage every 3 years. We wouldn't have to keep reading and rereading, because we're not going to get it on the first pass. And if we get, and we're always going to get something out of it, but, this year, we read the story today, about Jesus and going to raise the little girl from the dead, and the woman that's having these medical problems. It's like, okay, 3 years from now, we're going to read that again. Today, we took it a certain way because this is what's going on in my life and in the world. 3 years from now, things will be very different. So we might read the same story, but we're going to approach it differently because I'm different. And that's the value of Scripture, and we keep coming back to it. But again, parable is destroying what a formerly held belief. Not just to destroy it so something better can take its place. And ultimately, that is part and parcel of what Jesus is doing. He's destroying a worldview so it leaves room for what he is teaching to come in. I said that Job is a parable. Well, how does it start? It starts with a conversation between the devil and God, and the devil saying, I'm going to make you a bet. I bet I can take anybody and turn them against you. And God said, if they really love me, you can't do that. It's impossible. You can't do it. And the devil says, oh, yes, I can. And God says, oh, no, you can't. Yes, I can. No, you can't. So finally they make a bet. And Job is chosen as the guinea pig. And the devil is going to do everything he can to Job to get Job to abandon God. And the devil does everything he can do. And in the final analysis, not that Job didn't get angry with God. Job, if we were to translate a lot of the things that Job said in prayer that are there, if we were to translate them absolutely literally, we can't use them at church. God, he was shaking his fist. He was probably even waving to God, as we would say, read between the lines, Is that a bad thing? No, it's called being truthful. People will confess, I've got to confess I was angry with God, or I still am. I say, well, have you told God you're angry? Oh, no, how can I tell God I'm angry with him? As if he doesn't know, It's when we quit talking to God we're in trouble. If we're angry with God and we're still talking to God, we're not in trouble. We're just trying to work it out. We're just trying to work all this out with God, and yeah, we're upset, and we don't understand. What happens? We get angry, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not a sin to be angry with God. It's a sin to go into despair, and it's a sin to give up on God. But, so as we look at the story, what do we know? Well, if we think of what we read in Wisdom this morning, or what you're going to hear, about how God did not create death. God does not do bad things. God created us out of love, for love. God created us so that we can have very special lives. Those are all the things that God did. So for God to give up a human being to the devil's whims, that's not true. It's not going to happen. It'll never happen. God does not abandon us to the whims of the devil. So, and everybody would have known that that's not how God operated. It's so contrary to their faith. But as we go through the story and see everything the devil throws at Job, what do we learn? We learn that no matter what, God is still faithful to those who are faithful to him. We are never abandoned. And of course, the end of the story is Job had this fantastic, great life. By the end of the story, Job's life was infinitesimally better than the life beforehand. And, and they did equate, they equated, the people of the day, they did equate bad things with your personal sinfulness. They did attribute being handicapped to either your sin or the sin of another person. All of these things, they said, was a consequence of sin, all the bad stuff. And Job begins to teach us that no, good things happen, bad things happen to good people, and God didn't do it. So Job, functioning as a parable is truly destroying the way people used to look at God and how God operates, just so it can replace it with sort of a new faith and a new way of relating to God. If you have time in your day today, go back and reread the first reading from Wisdom. You can look it up online. Just go to the bishop's website, where it says readings, click on it, or if you've got, a missal at home, reread it. Because there, in the Old Testament, from the book of wisdom, Jewish wisdom, is our way we think of God. It's a wonderful little passage. Okay? All right. We won't meet next week because it is the 4th, but we will pick up. I was just going to do the 3, but I am going to go on because I took a lot longer on the first one just with general stuff. When we do gather again, it's going to be not so much the Gospels specifically, but it's going to be about the people in the Gospels, the culture, what the world was like, what their social customs were like. What was the day like in the average person walking the streets of Jerusalem? What was life like in Nazareth? So it won't be gospel specifically, but coming to understand those people. As we come to understand them, how they live, what they believe, what their social customs were, we start to see all of those showing up in the scriptures themselves. Okay? Wonderful.